The champagne glass shattered so hard against the hardwood floor that the entire ballroom-style patio went silent. Not quiet silent. The kind of silence that only happens when something deeply unexpected cracks the air wide open. A second earlier, my cousin Rick had been laughing so hard he nearly spilled barbecue sauce on his white polo shirt. Let me guess. He snorted loudly enough for half the party to hear. They called you princess. I'd taken a slow sip of iced tea before answering. Hades, that was it, one word. But the retired Navy SEAL standing near the outdoor bar dropped his champagne glass like he'd seen a ghost. The old man stared at me with pale blue eyes that suddenly looked 20 years younger and 20 years more afraid. No, he whispered. Then he stood up straight and saluted me right there in front of my entire family. That was the moment my cousin realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The barbecue was meant to be a straightforward affair. Just one relaxed afternoon for my Aunt Donna's 75th birthday celebration out near Waco, Texas. Nothing extravagant or over the top. There were folding chairs scattered across the patio, country music floating lazily from worn-out speakers, men debating football scores next to the smokers loaded with brisket, and grandkids darting around with melting popsicles dripping down their arms. It was classic, everyday American family time. I had almost skipped it entirely. Honestly, I hadn't shown up to one of these get-togethers in close to 8 years. Families have long memories, particularly for the awkward or unusual details, and in mine I was mostly known as the odd relative, the reserved one. The woman who had vanished into military service and never fully returned to civilian life. Most of them figured I had spent my time handling some unremarkable office role, shuffling documents in administrative buildings. I never bothered setting them straight. It kept things simpler that way. At 53, I had come to understand a truth that often only sinks in after attending too many funerals. Inner peace holds more value than any form of acknowledgement. Even so, Aunt Donna had reached out personally. Claire, she had said gently during our phone call, I'm not getting any younger, sweetheart. It would mean the world to have you here. So I made the 3-hour drive. I carried along a fresh peach cobbler and quietly vowed to slip away before dusk if Rick began hitting the drinks too heavily. Sadly, Rick had started in on the alcohol well before noon. My cousin had always been boisterous in that typical way of men masking their insecurities. He wasn't malicious, merely full of bluster. The sort who mistook being loud for being assured. He sold recreational vehicles just outside Dallas and approached every discussion as if closing a big sale for a bonus. By the time I pulled up, he was already deep into imported beers, commanding attention by the grill. Well, look who finally came back from Area 51, he had called out loudly upon spotting me. A handful of relatives chuckled. I offered a courteous smile. You still alive, Rick? Barely. Inflation's trying to kill me. That drew more laughs. I embraced Aunt Donna warmly, kissed her on the cheek, and pitched in by carrying food trays from the kitchen out to the patio, while the others lounged around chatting about politics and rising fuel costs. No one paid me much mind, which suited me perfectly. Around 4 in the afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway. An older gentleman emerged, dressed in a navy blazer that seemed out of place in the Texas warmth. He was tall and trim, with white hair trimmed in a precise military cut. Even prior to Aunt Donna's introduction, I picked up on his bearing right away. Those who have seen real combat move through the world with a distinct presence, no matter their age. This is Walter Briggs, Aunt Donna declared with clear pride. He served alongside Harold back in the day. Harold was her deceased husband. Walter made his way around the patio shaking hands until his gaze settled on me. For the briefest moment his face shifted, recognition flashing, followed by bewilderment and then doubt. I averted my eyes first. I should have sensed then that the afternoon was headed off course. As evening approached, Rick had shifted from mildly irritating to outright overbearing. He had drawn a little crowd near the patio cooler and was recounting tales of his high school gridiron glory days, as if he had nearly reached professional levels. I sat peacefully by the railing, observing the sunlight fading across the open fields past Aunt Donna's land, when Rick strolled over with a beer in hand. So, he announced in a booming voice, you ever actually see any real action in the army? I gave a slight shrug. From time to time, what's that supposed to mean? It drew a few chuckles from the cousins. Rick's grin broadened. You shoot guns and stuff like that, now and then. Ever get into any fights? His voice carried that mocking undertone guys often use when they believe they're putting someone on the spot. I could sense Walter Briggs observing us intently from the far side of the patio. I should have ended the exchange right there. But perhaps because weariness had settled in, or maybe after 2 decades I was simply drained from always diminishing myself, I responded with straightforward honesty. Only hand to hand, I said evenly. Knives were optional. The whole group erupted in laughter. Rick smacked the table hard. Oh, come on. I simply smiled down into my iced tea. Then came the remark that changed everything. Let me guess, he chuckled. They called you princess. I met his gaze straight on. Hades. The champagne glass shattered 1 second later. Walter Briggs had gone completely pale, not shocked pale, haunted pale. The old seal stared at me like he was looking straight through 20 years of buried memories. No damn way, he whispered. Rick blinked. What? Walter slowly approached me. You were Task Unit 7, he said quietly. I didn't answer. You flew Kandahar extraction routes. Still silent. Walter's breathing changed. My family looked back and forth between us, confused. Rick forced out a laugh. Okay, hold on. What's happening? Walter ignored him completely. He looked at me the way soldiers look at graves. I heard you were dead. The patio had gone still except for distant cicadas buzzing in the trees. I set my glass down carefully. Not dead, I said softly. Walter's eyes glistened slightly. My God, he whispered, Hades. Then in front of my entire family, the retired Navy SEAL straightened his back and saluted me, and for the first time in my life, my cousin stopped laughing. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Walter Briggs saluted me, not even Rick. And trust me, getting Rick Donnelly to stop talking was impressive enough to qualify as a small miracle. The Texas evening breeze moved softly through the oak trees around Aunt Donna's property while everybody stared at me like I'd suddenly grown another head. I hated attention, always had. That surprise people felt when they discovered who I used to be. It never felt satisfying the way movies make it seem. Mostly it just made me tired. Rick finally forced out an awkward laugh. Okay, he said, glancing around nervously. What exactly is going on here? Walter didn't answer immediately. The old seal kept staring at me with the kind of expression veterans only wear around certain names, certain memories. Finally, he looked at Rick. You got any idea who your cousin is? Rick smirked weakly. Apparently not, Walter nodded slowly. No, he said, apparently not. Aunt Donna looked deeply confused now. Claire, she asked carefully, what is he talking about? I sighed softly and leaned back in my chair. Nothing important. Walter immediately shook his head. With respect, he said, that's not true. I could feel every pair of eyes on me now. My younger cousins had stopped chasing their kids around the yard. Even the country music humming from the speakers suddenly seemed too loud. I hated this. For 20 years, I'd worked very hard to become invisible, and invisibility is hard-earned, especially after war. Walter finally pulled out a chair and sat across from me. You really disappeared, he murmured. I meant to. He gave a quiet laugh through his nose. Hell, people talked about you like a ghost story. Rick folded his arms. Okay, somebody better start explaining. Walter glanced toward him. You ever hear soldiers talk about call signs? Sure. Well, Walter said carefully, most call signs are jokes, nicknames, dumb stories. He pointed toward me. Not that one. Rick looked at me, then back at Walter. You're serious. Walter's eyes never left mine. Son, there were Rangers, SEALs, Marines, pilots, men who owed their lives to her. The patio fell silent again. I could almost hear people mentally replaying every assumption they'd ever made about me. The weird cousin, the quiet loner, the unmarried woman who lived alone outside Temple with her old truck and vegetable garden. Funny how people build entire stories around silence. Rick scoffed lightly, trying to recover. Come on, he said, you're acting like she was Rambo. Walter's expression hardened instantly. No, he said quietly, Rambo was fiction. That shut Rick up. Aunt Donna slowly sat beside me. Claire, sweetheart, what did you do in the army? I looked down at my hands for a moment. At my age, your hands tell stories before your mouth does. Scars, burn marks, old fractures. I flew medevac support, I said simply. Walter corrected me immediately. You flew black zone extraction. I closed my eyes briefly. Still hated hearing those words. Most civilians have no idea what military pilots actually do in war zones. They imagine movies, flags, hero speeches. Real war is usually exhaustion mixed with terror and helicopters. God, helicopters are where fear becomes physical. You feel every vibration in your bones, every sound matters, every second matters. Walter leaned back slowly. Kandahar, he murmured, fall of 2003. I said nothing. Rick frowned. What happened in Kandahar? Walter looked toward the darkening fields beyond the patio. The mission went bad. His voice had changed now. Quieter, older. There was a SEAL recon unit trapped after an ambush outside the city. Sandstorm rolling in, visibility collapsing, enemy fighters everywhere. Several relatives were completely still now, Walter continued. Command told air support to back off. He looks directly at me, but one pilot ignored the order. I stared at my untouched tea. That wasn't bravery, I said quietly, it was anger. Walter shook his head. No, he replied, it was courage. I almost laughed at that. People who survive war often get called courageous by people who never saw how much fear was involved. Truth is courage usually feels ugly, messy, desperate. Rick still looked unconvinced. So what she rescued some soldiers? Walter turned toward him slowly. Son, he said, those men were already considered dead. That landed differently. Even Rick felt it. Walter pointed gently toward me. She flew into a sandstorm nobody else would touch. My throat tightened slightly. I still remembered the radio static, the screaming alarms, the taste of blood where I'd bitten through my lip. Some memories never fade, they just get quieter with age, Walter continued. The helicopter got hit twice. Aunt Donna gasped softly, but she still landed. Nobody spoke. Even the little kids nearby seemed to sense something heavy in the air. Rick cleared his throat. Well, if all this is true, why haven't we ever heard about it? That answer came easily. Because I didn't want you to. Everyone looked at me again. I finally lifted my eyes. Do you know what happens after enough war? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. You stop wanting attention. The breeze shifted across the patio. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked. Very normal sounds. That's the strange thing about life-changing moments. The world keeps moving anyway. Walter studied me carefully. You still blame yourself. I gave him a tired smile. Occupational hazard. He leaned forward. You saved 31 men, not all of them. Walter's face darkened slightly. No, he admitted quietly. That old ache moved through my chest again, not sharp anymore, just familiar. Aunt Donna reached over and gently touched my arm. Oh, Claire, I looked away. I'd spent decades making sure nobody pitied me. Pity was dangerous. Once people start feeling sorry for veterans, they stop seeing them as human beings. They either turn you into a hero or a tragedy. Neither one feels real. Rick suddenly shifted awkwardly beside the cooler. So, he rubbed the back of his neck. Why'd they call you Hades? Walter answered before I could. Because no matter how bad the situation got, he paused, she always went into hell to bring people home. Nobody laughed after that, not one person. The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the Texas sky orange and purple beyond the trees. Walter kept staring at me with unsettled eyes, then his expression changed. Not admiration this time, concern, deep concern. Claire, he said carefully, why did you disappear after Kandahar? My stomach tightened instantly, there it was. The question I'd spent 20 years outrunning. Around us, the party noises faded into uneasy silence because the truth was Kandahar wasn't the reason I vanished. It was what happened after. The air changed after Walter asked that question. Even the breeze across Aunt Donna's patio seemed to slow down. Why did you disappear after Kandahar? Nobody touched their food anymore. Rick lowered his beer. My younger cousins looked confused and uncomfortable, like they were suddenly realizing the strange older woman at family cookouts had lived an entire year life. None of them understood. I stared out across the dark Texas fields for several long seconds before answering. Because some things follow you home, I said quietly. Walter's face tightened. He already knew, at least part of it, but my family didn't. And once certain stories are spoken out loud, you can't put them back into silence. I folded my hands together slowly. Kandahar wasn't supposed to become a rescue mission, I began. The memories came back sharper than I wanted. Funny how trauma works. You can't forget birthdays, phone numbers, names, but fear stays preserved like glass. It started as a routine extraction support operation, I continued. Small recon unit in and out before sunrise. Walter nodded once. The sandstorm hit early, he added quietly. Yeah, I could still remember the sky turning orange-black over Afghanistan. One moment visibility was manageable. The next moment it looked like the world itself was collapsing. We lost communications twice, I said. Then the recon team got ambushed moving toward the extraction point. Rick shifted in his chair. What kind of ambush? The kind where people stop coming home. That shut him up again. I leaned back slowly. The enemy already knew where they were headed. Heavy gunfire RPGs, 2 men down immediately. Aunt Donna pressed a hand against her chest. Oh my lord, I kept going because stopping would have been worse. The command channel ordered all air units to withdraw. Walter looked down at the table. Nobody liked that part, especially veterans, because sometimes war isn't about bravery. Sometimes it's about watching institutions protect themselves first. The storm was getting worse, I continued. One pilot turned back, then another. And you didn't, Walter said softly. I shook my head. No, Rick frowned. Why not? I looked directly at him. Because they were still alive. Simple as that. The room stayed quiet. Older Americans understand something younger people often don't. When you've lived long enough, the plain truths usually hit the hardest. I closed my eyes briefly. I remember hearing one of the SEALs over the radio, I said, could barely understand him through the static. Walter's jaw tightened. He was praying, he muttered. Yeah, I swallowed carefully. He thought nobody was coming. The patio had become so silent I could hear insects humming beyond the fence line. I flew blind for most of the final approach, I said. Couldn't see terrain, couldn't see enemy movement, could barely see my own instrument panel. Rick looked genuinely unsettled now. And you still landed, hardest landing of my life. The old memories moved through me again. Rotor vibration, dust choking the cockpit, warning alarms screaming, then the gunfire. God, the gunfire. Bullets tore through the left side before we even touched ground, I said quietly. Aunt Donna covered her mouth. Walter looked exhausted just hearing it again. The SEAL team was already carrying wounded when I landed, I continued. One man missing part of his leg, another barely conscious. Rick whispered, Jesus. I ignored the sympathy in his voice. I wasn't interested in sympathy anymore, not after all these years. We loaded everybody we could, I said, then another RPG hit nearby. Walter nodded grimly. That's when the fire started. Yeah. The smell returned instantly in my mind. Burning hydraulic fluid, burned metal, burned flesh. Some smells never leave you. Rick stared at me differently now. Not mockingly, not confidently, just uncertain. So how'd you get out? I almost smiled. That's the part people usually call heroic. Walter looked at me carefully, but you don't know. I rubbed my thumb slowly across an old scar on my palm. Heroic means you had choices, I said. Most of us didn't. The truth settled heavily over the patio. I continued quietly. We lifted off overloaded and half blind in the middle of the storm. Walter added softly with enemy vehicles closing in. Yeah. A younger cousin near the patio door whispered, this sounds like a movie. I shook my head immediately. No, I said firmly, movies end clean. That line stayed hanging in the warm night air. Because this part wasn't clean, not even close. The mission report blamed mechanical failure, I said eventually. Rick frowned, but that wasn't true. No, Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. Here it came, the ugliest part. The commanding officer in charge of the operation panicked, I said quietly. He ordered everybody to retreat before the ground team was secured. Aunt Donna looked confused, but if they left, those soldiers would have died. They almost did. Walter's voice turned cold. He abandoned them. I nodded once. But after we got back, politics started. Rick blinked. Politics. I laughed softly without humor. Military careers, public image, command reputation. The bitterness in my own voice surprised me. Maybe because I spent years pretending it was gone. The officer responsible had powerful connections, I continued, and somebody needed to absorb the blame for the operation falling apart. Rick stared at me. You, me, nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. They said I acted recklessly, I said I violated withdrawal orders, said I endangered military assets. Walter slammed his palms softly against the table. You saved lives, didn't matter. The old SEAL shook his head with visible anger. I tried fighting it, I know, but the brass buried everything. Yeah. The bitterness in Walter's eyes told me he'd carried this anger almost as long as I had. Rick spoke carefully now. So they punished you for rescuing people. I looked at him calmly. No, I said, they punished me for embarrassing somebody important. That hit him harder than the war stories. Because Americans over a certain age understand institutions, understand pride, understand cowardice wearing expensive uniforms. I leaned back slowly. After that, things collapsed fast. My throat tightened slightly. My marriage fell apart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't be around crowds. Every helicopter sound sent my heart racing. Walter lowered his eyes. I heard about the divorce. Yeah, I gave a faint shrug. He said the war got more of me than he ever had. Nobody knew how to respond to that, because what do you say? Some losses happen slowly, quietly, like rust. Rick looked down at his beer for a long moment before finally speaking. So all these years. I finished the sentence for him. You thought I was just some weird old woman who hated family parties. His face flushed slightly. I mean, kind of. I actually smiled a little. At least you're honest. The tension loosened for one brief second. Then Walter spoke again and the warmth vanished immediately. The officer who buried the truth, he said quietly. He's here in Texas tomorrow. My stomach dropped. I already knew the name before he said it. Daniel Mercer, Walter muttered darkly. Retired general now, I stared at him. Walter's expression hardened. He's the guest speaker at the Veterans Fundraiser in Austin tomorrow night. The old memories turned cold inside my chest. Because after 20 years, the man who destroyed my life was suddenly 1 hour down the highway. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid of seeing Daniel Mercer again. At my age, fear changes shape. When you're young, you fear bullets and failure and embarrassment. When you're older, you fear memories. I spent most of the night sitting on the back porch of my small house outside Temple, Texas, listening to crickets and staring into darkness while old sounds returned. Rotor blades, radio static, men screaming coordinates through gunfire. By morning, my chest already felt tired. At around 10, Walter Briggs called. You going tonight? He asked. No, you should. I spent 20 years avoiding men like Mercer. Walter was quiet for a second. Claire, he said carefully, sometimes avoiding pain also means avoiding closure. I hated when old veterans got philosophical before noon. I'm not looking for closure. What are you looking for? That question lingered longer than I expected. Finally, I answered honestly, peace. Walter sighed softly. Then maybe it's time. By 6:30 that evening, I was standing outside the Austin Veterans Memorial Center wondering why I'd ignored my own instincts. The parking lot was full. Luxury SUVs, pickup trucks, American flags mounted near the entrance. Inside, donors and retired officers mingled beneath warm chandelier lighting, while waiters carried trays of wine and shrimp cocktails. The room smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood. The kind of place where people honored sacrifice comfortably. Walter met me near the entrance. You came, still deciding if that was smart. He gave me a faint smile. You look nervous. I'm considering assaulting an elderly general. That actually made him laugh. For a moment, I almost relaxed. Then I saw Daniel Mercer, and suddenly it felt like Afghanistan had reached through 20 years to grab me by the throat. Mercer stood near the ballroom stage, surrounded by donors and local politicians. Tall, silver-haired, perfect posture, the kind of man America trusted instantly. He wore confidence like another military decoration. People shook his hand constantly. Veterans thanked him for his service. A younger reporter hovered nearby with a camera crew. Walter noticed my expression. You okay? No. Mercer turned slightly while laughing at something someone said, then he saw me. His smile disappeared immediately. Not confusion, recognition, instant recognition. And underneath it, fear, tiny, fast, but real. The general excused himself from the group and slowly walked toward us. Walter straightened beside me automatically, old instincts. Mercer stopped a few feet away. Claire Donovan, he said calmly. His voice sounded exactly the same. That bothered me more than it should have. General Mercer, the title tasted bitter. His eyes scanned me carefully. You look well, that makes one of us. Walter coughed softly to hide a laugh. Mercer ignored him. I heard you left Texas years ago. I heard you rewrote history. That landed harder. The air between us tightened immediately. Mercer's polished smile returned, but thinner now. Still angry, I see. I stared directly into his eyes. Still lying, I see. Walter shifted slightly beside me. People nearby had begun noticing the attention. Mercer lowered his voice. This isn't the place. No, I replied softly. You made sure of that 20 years ago. The ballroom lights dimmed shortly afterward as guests moved toward their tables. Walter and I sat near the back. I would have left already if pride hadn't kept me planted in that chair. That's the ugly truth nobody admits. Sometimes revenge begins simply because you're tired of swallowing humiliation. An announcer stepped onto the stage. Tonight, he said warmly, we honor leadership, courage, and lifelong service. Mercer received a standing ovation before he even touched the microphone. I stayed seated, Walter did too. Mercer began speaking smoothly about patriotism and sacrifice. The crowd loved him, of course they did. Men like Mercer always knew exactly what America wanted to hear, especially older Americans. Duty, honor, country, he spoke beautifully. That was part of the problem. Then his eyes found me again near the back table and everything changed. There are, Mercer said into the microphone, unfortunately, some people who never fully adjust after war. Walter stiffened beside me. I already knew where this was going. Mercer continued calmly, trauma affects judgment, memory, emotional stability. Several people glanced toward our table now. Coward. The old anger inside me stirred awake for the first time in years. Mercer folded his hands behind his back like a statesman. Leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions under pressure. Not everyone understands those realities. Walter muttered, son of a Mercer was doing it again, same as before, using polished language to bury truth. The crowd listened respectfully. Most had no idea they were watching a man defend cowardice in real time. Then Mercer smiled faintly. And sadly, he added, some former personnel build myths around themselves afterward. Walter slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle silverware. That turned heads immediately. Mercer looked directly at him and Walter Briggs stood up. I was there. The room went completely still. Walter's old voice carried farther than I expected. Mercer's expression darkened instantly. Walter, he warned quietly. No, Walter snapped, you've talked long enough. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Nobody moved. Walter pointed toward me. That woman flew into a goddamn firestorm while you ran. The ballroom exploded into whispers. Mercer's face turned pale. You don't know what you're talking about, he said sharply, but now another voice spoke up. I do. A man near the front slowly rose from a wheelchair, older Marine, gray beard, missing left leg. He looked toward me with wet eyes. She saved my life. Silence swallowed the room again, then another veteran stood, then another. A medic, a former ranger, an elderly father holding a folded military cap. One by one they spoke. She brought my son home. She carried wounded men herself. We were told nobody was coming. Mercer's confident posture finally cracked. I sat frozen while 20 years of buried truth rose into the room like smoke. Walter stepped closer to the stage. The Kandahar files were partially declassified last year, he said loudly. People can read them now. Mercer's jaw tightened. Walter's voice shook with fury. You abandoned your men. Nobody applauded now, nobody smiled. The ballroom had become a courtroom, and for the first time in 2 decades, Daniel Mercer looked small. Then the Marine in the wheelchair slowly raised a trembling hand to his forehead and saluted me. The entire room watched in silence, some with shock, some with shame, some with tears. And suddenly I realized something strange. After 20 years, I no longer wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to stop hiding. The ballroom never fully recovered after that. Even after the applause died away, even after people slowly returned to their seats, the mood had changed too much. Truth does that sometimes, especially old truth. It settles into a room like smoke and makes everybody breathe differently. Daniel Mercer tried finishing his speech, but the confidence was gone now. People still listened politely because Americans over 60 were raised to respect uniforms and ceremony, but you could feel the shift. Once doubt enters a room, reputation starts leaking quietly through the cracks. Mercer wrapped up 10 minutes later to scattered applause, nothing like the standing ovation from earlier. Walter leaned toward me. You okay? I watched Mercer step away from the podium while avoiding eye contact with half the ballroom. I don't know yet, and that was the truth. I'd spent 20 years imagining what justice would feel like. Turns out it mostly felt exhausting. The fundraiser ended shortly afterward. Clusters of veterans and donors gathered around the lobby speaking in hushed voices. Several older men approached me carefully, not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly. That's how older veterans usually handle respect. One retired ranger shook my hand and said, "Thank you for bringing our boys home." Another man in a Vietnam veteran cap hugged me without saying a word. A woman in her 70s pressed a folded photograph into my hand. "My son talked about you before he died," she whispered. I looked down at the picture. Young Marine, big smile, desert camouflage. My chest tightened immediately. "Oh," I whispered softly, "I remember him." And I did. That was the burden nobody explains about surviving war. You carry faces forever. The woman squeezed my hand gently. "He said you stayed calm when everybody else panicked." I almost laughed at that. I'd never felt calm once in my entire military career. But soldiers often mistake quiet fear for courage. Walter and I eventually stepped outside into the warm Austin night air. The fundraiser noise faded behind us while traffic moved steadily along the nearby highway. Texas nights always smell faintly like dust and gasoline in summer. Walter lit a cigarette despite probably being told not to by 6 different doctors. "You know this is going to spread fast," he said. I figured. The veteran community never forgets names. I leaned against the concrete railing outside the building. "You know what's funny? What? I spent 20 years trying to disappear." Walter gave a tired smile, "and one barbecue ruined it. That actually made me laugh for real." The first real laugh in a long time, then Walter grew serious again. "You deserved better, Claire." I stared out toward the parking lot lights. Maybe once years ago hearing that would have mattered more, but age changes your relationship with fairness. At some point you realize life rarely balances the books cleanly. "You know what I regret most?" I asked quietly. Walter shook his head. "I let bitterness isolate me." The old SEAL didn't answer immediately because he understood. Veterans are very good at isolation. We build entire lives around avoiding pain, and after enough years, loneliness starts feeling normal. By the next morning, the story had already started moving through military circles online. Walter wasn't kidding. Calls came all day. Old pilots, former medics, retired officers, people I hadn't spoken to in decades somehow found my number within hours. One man cried on the phone before saying a single word. Another simply said, "Thought you should know we never believed the official story." That one hit harder than I expected because deep down I think part of me always believed I'd truly been abandoned by everybody. Turns out silence and betrayal aren't always the same thing. Around noon, Rick showed up at my house unexpectedly. I saw his truck pull into the driveway while I was watering tomato plants. He climbed out awkwardly holding a paper bag from a local bakery. That alone told me he was nervous. Rick normally apologized with jokes, not pastries. I set the hose down. "What's in the bag?" "Peach turnovers." I nodded slowly. "That's serious, huh?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Can I come in?" We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. Rick looked uncomfortable in the way middle-aged men do when they realize they've behaved badly. Finally, he sighed, I owe you an apology. You do? He nodded. I was an ass. Also true, that earned a weak smile, then his face turned serious again. I really thought you were exaggerating at the barbecue. I know, no, he said quietly. I mean, I thought you were lonely. That surprised me. Rick stared down into his coffee. You always stayed away from people, he admitted. I figured maybe you wanted attention. I leaned back slowly. That's fair. No, he said immediately, it isn't. The sincerity in his voice softened something inside me. Rick looked around my small kitchen. You've been carrying all this alone. I gave a small shrug. For a while, he shook his head slowly. That general, he paused. How does somebody live with doing that to another person? I thought about Daniel Mercer standing on that stage pretending to be honorable. Then I answered honestly. Probably the same way the rest of us survive hard things. Rick frowned. How? By lying to ourselves carefully. 3 days later, Mercer called me personally. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice sounded older now, not physically older, spiritually older. Claire, he said quietly, could we meet? Every instinct told me no, but another part of me, the tired part, wanted the story finished properly. So we met at a small diner outside Georgetown. Nothing dramatic, Claire's throat, just coffee and silence. Mercer looked terrible. The polished confidence was gone. Without the podium and medals, he suddenly seemed like what he truly was, an aging man carrying decades of shame. He stared at his untouched coffee for a long time before speaking. I was afraid, he admitted. I said nothing. The storm hit, communications collapsed, and I panicked. There it was, not strategy, not politics, cowardice, simple human cowardice. His eyes looked wet now. I kept telling myself withdrawing was tactical. He swallowed hard, but the truth is I was terrified. I watched him carefully. This was the man I'd hated for 20 years, and suddenly he just looked tired, broken even. Mercer rubbed his trembling hands together. You want to know something awful? I stayed silent. I hated you, he whispered, because every time someone mentioned your name, I remembered exactly who I really was. The diner grew quiet around us. Older couples drank coffee nearby. Country music played softly overhead, ordinary American life continuing around two damaged people. Mercer finally looked up at me. After everything I did, he asked hoarsely, why didn't you destroy me years ago? I stared at him for a very long time before answering. Because the truth was, I'd spent 20 years asking myself the exact same question. Daniel Mercer sat across from me in that little diner looking like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway while pickup trucks rolled past in steady Texas traffic. Inside, a waitress refilled coffee cups and called everybody honey. Ordinary life, that's the strange thing about heavy moments. The world never pauses for them. Mercer waited for my answer. Why didn't you destroy me years ago? I looked down at my coffee for a long moment before speaking. Because hatred gets heavy, I said quietly. He blinked slowly. You carry it long enough. Eventually it carries you. The old general lowered his eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Mercer looked completely honest. Not polished, not commanding, just tired. I told myself I was protecting careers, he admitted softly. Protecting the military, protecting morale. I nodded once. That's how people survive guilt, they rename it. Mercer swallowed hard. I ruined your life. For years hearing those words was all I thought I wanted. Some admission, some apology, some recognition. But sitting there across from him, I realized something important. Pain doesn't disappear just because somebody finally admits they caused it. It still happened. The lost years still existed. The nightmares still existed. The divorce papers, the panic attacks, the isolation, none of that magically vanished. But strangely, the anger had already started fading before this conversation even began. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. I don't expect forgiveness. That's good, I replied calmly, because forgiveness isn't a transaction. He nodded faintly. Then we sat quietly for a while, listening to dishes clatter behind the counter. Two old people carrying different kinds of regret. A week later, Walter invited me to a veterans support gathering in Killeen. Small room, nothing fancy. Just folding chairs, coffee, and older veterans trying to help younger ones stay afloat after service. Normally, I would have refused. For years, I avoided veteran events whenever possible. Too many ghosts in one room, but this time felt different. Maybe because something inside me had finally loosened. Maybe because after spending decades hiding from my past, I was getting tired of running from it. Walter introduced me simply. This is Claire. No dramatic speech, no medals, no war stories. Just Claire, and honestly, I appreciated that more than he probably realized. The group included young soldiers recently back from overseas, a few older Vietnam vets, one Marine missing 2 fingers. Another man who barely spoke the entire evening. I recognized that silence immediately. Trauma has a sound, and sometimes the sound is nothing at all. Walter eventually asked if I'd share something. At first, I didn't want to. Then I noticed one younger veteran sitting near the wall staring down at the floor exactly the way I used to after Afghanistan. That look changed my mind. So I stood slowly and spoke. I began quietly. People hear military stories and think the hardest part is combat. Several veterans nodded slightly. But for a lot of us, I continued, the hardest part comes afterward. The room stayed completely still. I spoke slowly, carefully, not like a speech, more like a confession. You come home and everybody expects you to return to normal immediately. A few bitter laughs moved through the room. But war changes the speed of your thinking, I said. Changes how you sleep. Changes how safe the world feels. The younger veteran near the wall finally looked up at me. For years, I admitted I thought isolation was strength. Walter watched quietly from the back. I thought shutting people out protected me. I smiled faintly, but loneliness is sneaky. It starts feeling comfortable after a while. Several older veterans nodded hard at that one because they knew. God, they knew. One man finally raised his hand. Gray-haired Army veteran, probably early 70s. Can I ask something? Sure, he hesitated. Why'd they call you Hades? A few people in the room shifted curiously. I looked down at my hands before answering. For years, people assumed the call sign meant something dark, dangerous, violent. But the truth was never what they expected. The first team that gave me the name, I said softly, used it after a rescue mission went bad. The room stayed silent. I smiled gently. One of the SEALs said. I paused briefly. No matter how deep into hell we got, she always came back for us. Nobody spoke afterward, not immediately. Because older Americans understand something younger audiences sometimes miss. The most meaningful moments usually arrive quietly. No music, no explosions, just truth landing softly inside a room. After the meeting ended, several younger veterans stayed behind talking longer than they probably intended. One thanked me for speaking honestly about isolation. Another admitted he hadn't talked to his own daughter in 8 months. That one hurt to hear. Before leaving, the quiet young veteran from earlier finally approached me near the coffee table. He looked nervous. You really think people can come back from that stuff? He asked. From what? He shrugged helplessly. The darkness. I studied him carefully. Then I answered the only honest way I knew how. Not completely, I said, but enough to live again. His eyes watered slightly. He nodded once. And somehow that moment mattered more to me than every medal I'd ever received. That evening I drove home alone beneath a deep orange Texas sunset, windows down, warm air rolling through the truck. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I thought about Aunt Donna, Walter, Rick, even Daniel Mercer. Life had wounded all of us differently. Some people responded with arrogance, some with guilt, some with isolation. But underneath it all, most people were simply trying to survive themselves. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck a little longer watching evening light settle across the fields, and I realized something. People thought Hades meant death, fear, violence, but they were wrong. It meant bringing people back from hell, including yourself. And maybe that's true for more people than we realize. Maybe some of us spend years carrying pain silently because we think nobody else would understand. Maybe pride keeps families apart longer than it should. Maybe forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, but finally refusing to let bitterness become your final identity. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you forgave, or even a part of yourself you're still trying to heal, then I hope you'll carry that feeling forward. Share it with somebody who might need it. And remember, sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're simply the ones who survived and chose kindness anyway.